Some of the wondrous works which we behold in our world today have been manifested through the operation of His supreme and most exalted will. And the outstanding works of calligraphy of Janabe Mirza Hossein Isfahani, surnamed Mishkín Qalam, who had the great bounty and rare privilege of having attained and lived under the sheltering grace of Baha'u'llah, the heavenly artist, the fashioner who left immortal impressions upon him. Mishkín Qalam was the son of Haji Muhammad Ali and was born in the year 1810 in Isfahan and lived to be 100. His father arranged a marriage for him with Agha Begum. They had 2 children, a daughter named Shah Begum and a son named Mirza Ali Akbar, who later lived with them in the Holy Land. Mishkín Qalam's father, Haji Muhammad Ali, being a merchant of Isfahan, had commercial transactions with reputed traders far and wide. A certain merchant of Tehran and Mashhad, who had received a large quantity of goods from him, had not paid him. And thus the Haji decided to travel to Mashhad to inquire into the situation. To his great shock, he finds that the said merchant was bankrupt and unable to pay him, and eventually this shocking news was the cause of his death. In the meantime, Mishkín Qalam had acquired the necessary education and from his youth showed great intelligence and perception. He also acquired great skill in calligraphy in different styles and produced masterful paintings and sketches. One of his outstanding accomplishments was with the mere impression of his fingernails, he produced what came to be known as white script. Besides, with the same style, he would sketch people's portraits with great accuracy. After the death of his father, Mishkín Qalam, who was by now 25 years old, accompanied by his servant Ghambar, decides to go to Mashhad via Tehran to look into his father's affairs. He arrived in Tehran dusty and tired and was resting at the entrance of one of the shops when the Prime Minister, the Sadr Azam, passed by, and in all his pomp and glory. Mishkín Qalam hurriedly, with the impression of his fingernails, sketched the Sadr Azam's portrait on a piece of paper and casually handed it to the shopkeeper and departs. Later, when the Sadr Azam returns to the same street, the shopkeeper steps forward and hands over to the Prime Minister this amazing piece of art. The Prime Minister was very impressed and rewarded the shopkeeper and demanded to meet the artist, whereupon he was told that the artist, who was just a traveler passing through, had already departed and that he was not aware of his whereabouts. This greatly disappointed the Prime Minister, who warned him that he would have his head cut off if the artist was not found. These things happened in Iran. The shopkeeper requested 3 days' time, which was granted. He eventually found Ghambar the servant, who led him to his master Mishkín Qalam. After Mishkín Qalam was presented to the Prime Minister, he was invited to go and sketch him in the royal court with the beautiful surroundings. Being very satisfied with his remarkable work, he then presented Mishkín Qalam to the Shah of Persia, Nasruddin Shah, who, having praised him for his exceptional talent, appointed him as a tutor for the Crown Prince, who was at that time posted in Tabriz. He was also at that same time that the Shah gave the artist Mirza Hossein the title Mishkín Qalam, which means either musk-scented pen or jet-black pen. In a very short time, he became famous and wealthy as the Shah presented him with very valuable gifts. And his calligraphy found its way in the homes of the rich and the various art galleries and was much treasured. Although Mishkín Qalam sent sufficient money home, he was not granted leave to visit his family in Isfahan. His wife and mother both pleaded with the royal family to permit Mishkín Qalam to visit them. And finally, he was granted 2 months' leave to go and visit them. And it was after this brief visit with the family that Mishkín Qalam was returning to Tehran from Isfahan when he encountered Sayyid Mehdi, a very devout Baha'i. And having heard about the message of Baha'u'llah from him, he immediately accepted the Baha'i faith. And not even having informed the family or the Shah, in his eagerness, writes Abdul Baha, this greatly accomplished man, he set out to find Baha'u'llah. He crossed the great distances, climbing mountains, passing over deserts and over the sea, until at last he came to Adrianople. He responded to the summons of God and he attained the presence of Baha'u'llah. In the meantime, the Shah sent several messages and officials to inquire about Mishkín Qalam, and his picture was posted on all the leading gates of Persia, and great rewards were offered for information leading to his whereabouts. After spending some time in Adrianople, Mishkín Qalam, together with Ali Sayya and Jamshid Guri, proceeded to Constantinople. And I have to leave out some things because I think we are getting a bit late. And according to historian Adib Tahirzada, Baha'u'llah sent him on an important mission to Constantinople to counter the misrepresentations which had been spread abroad in royal circles by the notorious Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, the Antichrist of the Baha'i revelation. Also, both Sayya and Mishkín Qalam, who had obtained wide fame as a choreographist, were close to the Persian ambassador, but both of them, according to Agha Riza, were not sufficiently circumspect, talking unwisely in the circles to which they found access, particularly in the presence of the Persian ambassador. And eventually, the Persian ambassador, however, wielded enormous power. He slandered Mishkín Qalam. He said, "This man is an agitator," the ambassador told them, "sent here by Baha'u'llah to stir up trouble and make mischief in this great city." But actually, writes Abdul Baha, he was striving to bring about not sedition, but fellowship and peace. Consequently, Mishkín Qalam, Sayya, and few other Baha'is were imprisoned in Constantinople. The only thing we have from Baha'u'llah for Mishkín Qalam is a prayer that Baha'u'llah revealed to him. And this is a prayer that Baha'u'llah revealed jointly for Mishkín Qalam and Sayya, probably when they were imprisoned here, because it beseeches God in His greatness to render the prison as a sign of His bestowal unto them. And if God destines for them to be released from the prison, it would be through His power and might. And at the beginning of the prayer, the instruction reads that even if the prayer is chanted once, it is sufficient. When they were in prison, Ustad Muhammad Ali relates that Mishkín Qalam was particularly distraught because he had no pen or paper with which to practice his art. But at last the officials succumbed to his loud expostulations, and to obtain some peace, provided him with all the writing materials he needed, which greatly pacified him. And the great historian Baluzi writes that those excellent specimens of calligraphy of his inscribed will fetch hundreds, if not thousands, in the future. And recently, I don't know how far this is true, but one of the Persians told me when I was in Kelowna that recently at an auction in London, one of his paintings was auctioned, and I think a non-Baha'i purchased it, and it was in thousands of pounds. So I think what Mr. Baluzi said is so right. After their brief imprisonment, Mishkín Qalam and his companions were sent to Gallipoli, where they were waited for the arrival of Baha'u'llah and his companions, who were being sent to Akka. And it was here that the fate of Mishkín Qalam was determined by the authorities. For he and 3 other disciples of Baha'u'llah were sent to Cyprus in company with Mirza Yahya, the breaker of the covenant of the Bab and the arch enemy of Baha'u'llah. Mishkín Qalam was in Cyprus for 9 years, but the influence of Baha'u'llah had so permeated his soul that notwithstanding his long association with the perfidious Yahya, he remained steadfast in the cause. And Professor E.G. Brown also narrates about the Turkish government being determined to separate them and arranged to banish Yahya and his followers to the town of Cyprus and Mirza Hussain Ali to Akka. And he said, not so far as concerned Azhar, this plan worked very well. For Mishkín Qalam, he set out a little coffee shop at the port where travelers must needs arrive. And whenever he saw Persian land, he would invite them in, give them tea or coffee and a pipe, and gradually worm out of him the business which had brought them thither. And if his object was to see Sobh Azal, off went Mishkín Qalam to the authorities and reported them. And the pilgrim got packed off the island. Mishkín Qalam, when in Famagusta, at times became very depressed at having to be in company of Azal and his group, whom he mistrusted. Being witty and humorous whenever possible, he would poke fun at Azal's statements, and everyone present would laugh, and this would upset Azal. It is narrated that the Persian believers that Azal, when in Cyprus, did write a lot and stored it in a box, and due to excess humidity, he hung the box up from a ceiling. And there was a big drought, a long drought in Cyprus. And the people would come and talk to Mishkín Qalam, and he said that it's all because of that evil things that are in that box that you all are not getting rain. So they went and burnt the box. And so Mishkín Qalam got so nervous, he said, but he turned to God and he said, now I've done my share, it's your turn to do the rest. And so it rained, and he was really relieved after that. In 1978, Mishkín Qalam was freed when Cyprus passed out of Turkish hands and the British took over. He left for Akka, where he lived encompassed by the grace of Baha'u'llah, producing his marvelous calligraphy and sending them about. He was at all times joyous of spirit, ashine with the love of God like a candle burning its life away. And I'm sure the translators are going to be against me here too, because just before I came, I suddenly discovered this in one of the World Order magazines that America puts out. And it's the story about the forgotten author, E.S. Stevens, who has written in the book, the forgotten novel, The Mountain of God. And one of the few people he mentions in there is Abdul Baha that he met, and Mishkín Qalam. And he goes into great details of how he went into Mishkín Qalam's room, and there was just one wooden bed with a wooden box there, and a beautiful picture of that Mishkín Qalam had drawn hanging on the wall. And I won't go into the details of that, but I'll just read. He was accompanied by a Persian who went there because the Persian wanted to pick up his calligraphy that he probably had told Mishkín Qalam to do for him, because his brother had chanted the tablet of Baha'u'llah when he was dying as a martyr in Iran, and he had asked Mishkín Qalam to do calligraphy in that, and he had done it, so he had come to pick it up. And he says, when it was opened, he says that both men uttered an exclamation of wonder and admiration as they looked at that calligraphy. He says, to the Oriental, decorated calligraphy holds a high place amongst the art, and the peacock in 3 different colors, inks, its feathers composed of rows of exquisitely fine Persian writing, embellished by fanciful curves which showed the adept's touch, was to them a triumph of handicraft, a masterpiece of imagination. And to the initiated too, the arrangement of the letters had a mystical influence, for each letter has its numerical value and an historic meaning attached to these. And when they told him that it was a tablet, and then Mishkín Qalam, he says, points out, this is my signature, said the old man in a piping voice. He put his thin, scraggly finger on the corner. The Persian translated it, Mishkín Qalam, slave of Abdul Baha. He always signed his calligraphy. Before Baha'u'llah, when Baha'u'llah was alive, he would sign differently, and when Abdul Baha was there, he would sign. I will read on that later on. And they say, they know that for this Mishkín Qalam he's quoting, he said, they know that for my signature, anywhere from Bombay to Damascus, they know it, said the Mirza. His aged face lit up with a senile smile. For 70 years, that means he's been doing this calligraphy. He says, I'm very old, but your hand does not shake, said the guest. Alhamdulillah, my hand is sure. Alhamdulillah means thank God. They do not understand how to write nowadays, Mishkín Qalam said. They are too quick. The values of the letters are nothing to them. They even write on tables. There's only one way to write perfectly, and that is to hold the paper in the palm of your hand. And when one is learning, one should practice by night. There is no light like candlelight. But there are few who can write, and his thin voice was like a lament. The Mirza had great fame in Persia, said the Persian, but he left it all for the sake of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha. Yes, all of it I left, alhamdulillah. And then he says, I'm content, he said. I shall die in Akka near Abdul Baha, near the holy places. He sent for me to come from India, whither I had been sent. He recalled me. He knew that I should want to die in Akka. I'm content. He looked out towards the window, lost in dreams of his own, the childlike dreams of those who have lived so long that heaven is as near to them as is their infancy. And the Persian, he placed 5 Turkish pounds besides the still dreaming calligraphist, and with a salutation quietly withdrew. So in those days, his calligraphy was worth just 5 Turkish pounds. I won't go into all the other details that the man wrote, but following the ascension of Baha'u'llah, Mishkín Qalam was directed by Abdul Baha to travel to Egypt and India. Fazil Mazandarani records that Mishkín Qalam went to India in 1905, and according to Awara, he took some teaching activities there and also published several books with permission from Abdul Baha. Books like the Iqtidar and Ishraqat and the epistles and the Iran were exquisitely transcribed in his own script. Also, there was always 1 or 2 afnans in Bombay where they managed a prosperous publishing house and printing press from which the first Baha'i books ever to be printed were issued, such as the Kitab Iqtidarat and Kitab Mubin, which contain tablets of Baha'u'llah in the handwriting of Mishkín Qalam. Mrs. Shirin Fauzdar, whom I have known for many years in India, one of the very devoted early Zoroastrian Baha'is from India, remembers him as a little girl in Bombay. And she said because of a goatee beard and his long hair, she remembered him. And he says, Awara too writes of his features being jovial. And Awara makes fun. He said his chin did not hold more than a scanty beard comprising of a mere 19 to 95 meager hairs. And Mrs. Fauza recalls that Mishkín Qalam lived at Forbes Street in Bombay Hall in Bombay. And in those days, in Baha'is of Bombay were mostly Persians, and they knew the Persian language, so he may not have had much difficulty with the language. And then Mrs. Fauzdar, she tells me the story about when Baha'u'llah wanted to borrow a big samovar from Mishkín Qalam. And he sent a servant and said, go to Mishkín Qalam and ask for his samovar, as his samovar was bigger. But Mishkín Qalam refused. Twice the messenger returned to Baha'u'llah empty-handed, as Mishkín Qalam point-blank refused to lend the samovar to Baha'u'llah. Ultimately, he was sent for and asked why he was refusing. And then Mishkín Qalam replied that all these years he had asked Baha'u'llah for so many things, and his wish had not been granted. And he says now it was his turn to refuse. Abdul Baha, in one of his tablets to Mirza Ali Akbar-e Milani, mentions that he sent Mishkín Qalam to India in order that he may, in his splendid handwriting, correspond with the various learned and spiritual leaders and convey to them the message on his behalf that they should avoid interfering in politics, as every time they do, they would not only become suppressed, but the condition of their country would deteriorate. Janab Abdul Fazl Rahmani, his great-grandson, and I was very fortunate to have got in touch with him. And he sent me some beautiful insight into his great-grandfather Mishkín Qalam. He lives in Texas in the States. And shared with us the interesting episode, sending with it, he sent me a beautiful picture of Mishkín Qalam that I will share with you sometime, maybe even tomorrow. And he said that the father of Janabe Manuchere Maghami, who's an NSA member presently imprisoned in Iran, he said this father of this NSA member, he did business in Iran in antiques. And in southern Iran, they excavated a metallic bust about 1 meter long, and according to the dates inscribed on it, they concluded that it must be the bust of Zoroaster. And Mirza Agha Khan took this bust with him when he went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and eventually he was going to come to the United States and sell it as an antique and make a lot of money on it. One day he happened to mention it to Abdul Baha about the statue, and whereupon Abdul Baha asked him to bring the statue to him so he could have a look. And after having one look at it, Abdul Baha said, "No, this is not the bust of Zoroaster." And he pointed to Mishkín Qalam, and Mishkín Qalam was sitting there. He says, Mishkín Qalam Zoroaster looked like Mishkín Qalam. I think the Zoroastrians may be disappointed, but at the same time, I think we are very proud now as a Baha'i to think that he looked like a Zoroaster. Abdul Baha, no, I think I have to cut off some. Besides his outstanding calligraphy, Mishkín Qalam had a witty and subtle mind, and there are many stories and anecdotes that we hear often. Whenever Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, or the friends appeared sad, he always cheered them up, but it was always done with great reverence and dignity. It seems that Mishkín Qalam's wife was always nagging and complaining. She was a big nag, it seems. And Abdul Baha narrates that how one day when he went to visit them in their home in the Holy Land, Mishkín Qalam was busy writing while his wife was weeping. And Abdul Baha inquired and he said, "Why is she so unhappy?" And she said that Mishkín Qalam had been very, very harsh to her and had cursed her parents. And, they said something like Pedar Sukhta or something like this, but I'm not sure what he said. But Abdul Baha asked Mishkín Qalam the reason for such conduct, who, having put down his pen and paper with great humility and reverence, narrated the whole incidents to Abdul Baha about the cursing. He said that a long time ago his wife started to weep, and then he asked her what was the matter, and she said she wanted to have her residence changed. And Mishkín asked her why, since she was paying only 3 bishliks or something a month as rent in the pilgrim house. And she said, "No, I don't like the neighbors," and things like that. So he went and rented her another place. And then again he said, "I want my son also to have his own apartment and his own place." So he went, and I think he gave about 15 or 12 pounds a year, and he got him a place too. And she went, then again she started to cry, and he said, "Now what's the matter?" He says, "We don't have enough flour or tea in the house and this and that." He says, "Okay, I'll go and bring it," and he brought that. He says, "After I did everything to satisfy her, she was still complaining." And he says, but she continued complaining, and then in the middle of the night, in the midnight, she started to weep again and attacked him with the criticism that he had deserted her for those 11 long years in the prime of her life when she was so young. Because when he left Isfahan, he didn't tell her where he was going for 20 years. They didn't hear from them. So he says, "For 11 years in the prime of my life, you were not around." And she said, "I could have had several children in that period. And the doctors tell me that my health would have been so much better as a result of that." And she says, "And now I'm old, depressed, and indisposed." And she says, then Mishkín Qalam said, "What could I do at that hour?" He said, Mishkín Qalam said, "At that frightful moment in the middle of the night, now that I'm so old and weak, the only result I had was to curse her and her parents." And she says, "I told her off in such wise as to leave me in peace for once." Another story is told of Haji Mirza Haidar Ali. He is the author of The Delight of the Hearts. And Muhammad Tahir Malmiri, the father of the famous historian Adib Tahirzadeh. And it seems that one day both Mirza Haidar Ali and Muhammad Tahir Malmiri and Mishkín Qalam were in the presence of Baha'u'llah. And in a light vein, Baha'u'llah turned to Haji Mirza Haidar Ali and asked if he would like to go to the next world. He replied that if it was his will, he would comply. Then Baha'u'llah turned to Haji Muhammad Tahir Malmari, this is Adib's father, and asked the same question, to which he replied that many times he had entreated Baha'u'llah to die as a martyr, but that Baha'u'llah had preferred that he live long to teach the cause of God. But that if it was his will to go to the next world, he would humbly comply. And then Baha'u'llah turned to Mishkín Qalam and asked him the same question, and if he would want to be sent to the next world. And Mishkín Qalam, he nudged Haji Haidar Ali and says, "Please tell Baha'u'llah I'm hard of hearing. I don't know what he's talking about." Mishkín had a very jovial face and always poked fun at his own appearance. And he would say, I do not like to look myself in the mirror because I look like the devil. And the Persian believers recall the story. I can't guarantee anything about these stories because the Persians told me there's nothing in the book except the story that I told you of Abdul Baha, that last one. But the Persians narrated to me. And he says the Persian believers record the story of Mishkín Qalam when he lay lying on his deathbed. And he requested that his wife put on her finest apparel and her finest makeup and try and look beautiful. And that it was his last wish. And she inquired why he had made such an unusual wish. And he told her that since he was so ugly, when the angel of death would come, he would take her instead of him. Besides being a humorist, a companion, and a devoted servant, and one of the apostles of Baha'u'llah, he is best known as an artist of remarkable talent, unsurpassed as a calligrapher, and a genius in the creation of exquisite designs from letters and words, in Arabic, both in Arabic and Persian. The remnants of his penmanship of calligraphy are numerous in the Holy Land, Iran, Ottoman Empire, India, and even now in the Western world. My father had 3 originals of Mishkín Qalam. And I remember as a little girl, I just fell in love with these 2 that I have done. This one is the one he did it in Bombay. And my father had the original of that. And 2 others. And then last time I went to visit my father, I was so heartbroken when I saw that it wasn't there because I'm so very fond of birds. And this is why maybe I was attracted to his work of art when I was a little girl. And my father said he had donated one to the Baha'i New Era School and one he had sent to Chicago years ago. And another 2 he donated to another school in the south of India. So unfortunately I don't have, but I have copies of these that he sent me later. He tells us that, Abdul Baha tells us that he was a leading calligrapher in Persia and well known to all the great. He enjoyed special position amongst the court ministers of Tehran, and he was famed throughout Asia Minor. In Adrianople, he produced his splendid calligraphs. He would write out the most great name, Ya Baha'ul Abha, O thou the glory of the all-glorious, with marvelous skills in many different forms, and send them everywhere. And another story that Janabe Rahmani, his great-grandson, wrote to me, and I think the translators will have a hard time with that too because I just added it, is the original works that we have in the Holy Land of the greatest name, and it's a huge one, and I didn't realize it was Mishkín Qalam, otherwise I could have taken a picture of that time. And he said it was written with the handle of a shovel made out of thick, soft wood. He would hold it as though he was shoveling snow with both hands, and the most difficult part of it was he had a hard time finding a big enough parchment to write it on, which had to be specially treated and usually came from India and other parts of the world. He shaped the handle of the shovel like a reed pen, in the center of which he would cut a hole 5 centimeters deep and empty into it a bottle of ink, and then stuff it with fine silk thread and tie it up with the thread. And thus when he would tilt to write, the ink would flow evenly. And it's a huge Ya Baha'ul Abha, so when anybody goes on pilgrimage, they will see it. At that time, I didn't realize it was his. Also, Mishkín Qalam had a very strong arm, and his hands were very strong. And he was let the nail of his right hand, little finger, grow to about 1.5 centimeters in length. And then he would wet a piece of white paper and place it over a piece of felt. And with his nail, he would make impressions. And instead of writing, the Persian is written from right to left. Instead of writing from right to left, he would write from left to right in reverse style, like mirror image. And so when the page was turned, it was a perfect writing in the right way, right to left. And this came to be known as white script, and he was very good at that. And samples of this can be seen in the archives too. Unfortunately, I was not able to get samples of those things that were in the archives. And Baha'u'llah encouraged him to pursue his skill. For in Adrianople, when there were so many visitors coming and going and everything was happening so fast, Baha'u'llah rented a room specially for Mishkín Qalam so he could practice his art unhindered. And this house, Baha'u'llah honored several times with his presence. Again, Professor E.G. Brown met Mishkín Qalam in Akka. But when he was in Iran, in Persia, one of the dallals, dealers, showed him a work of Mishkín Qalam. And E.G. Brown writes that these would be eagerly sought after by Persians of all classes, the dallal told him, were it not that they all bore as the signature of the penman the following verse: Lord of calligraphy, my banner goes before, but to Baha'u'llah a bondsman at the door, not else am I, Mishkín Qalam. In most of his calligraphy works, you see that little thing down there, that's his signature. It would be mostly Naqsh style. But when Baha'u'llah was alive, he would say, a bondsman at the door, not else, my banner goes before, but to Baha'u'llah, a bondsman at the door. But after the passing of Baha'u'llah, he would sign. During the time of Baha'u'llah, Mishkín Qalam signed his works with his famous signature, the servant at the door of Baha Mishkín Qalam, together with the date. After the passing of Baha'u'llah, when Abdul Baha became the center of the covenant, the artist signed his work, the servant of Abdul Baha Mishkín Qalam. So it's very easy to identify his work, whether it was done during the time of Baha'u'llah or Abdul Baha. And this signature was very impressive, and most of the time he used the Naqsh script. Although Mishkín Qalam was skilled in all calligraphic styles, in his art he mostly used Shikasta, Nastaligh, Naqsh, and his own style, the Khatte-Murghi. It's like a bird script, because he was so fond of birds and he would write mostly in these birds, things like that. Mishkín Qalam may have been very fond of birds and was inspired to create some of his splendid calligraphy in the form of one bird or two birds together with the artistic arrangement of the words Bismillah al-Bahi al-Abha, meaning in the name of God, the glorious, the most glorious, in one of them, and also the two birds facing each other in the reverse mirror image form, which was prevalent at that time, with the greatest name ingeniously calligraphed within it. There are two different kinds of birds, some like doves with smooth crowns and tails flowing downwards, others that look like peacocks with their tail open upwards but almost the crown of a rooster. He may have been influenced by the Tau script. There was one of the scripts in the Islamic calligraphy known as Tau script, which means peacock script. Or he may have been influenced by the Islamic zoomorphic calligraphy, which became very popular in the 19th century, when in the animals and birds they would try to do their calligraphy. But Baha'u'llah's writings and utterance, which make so many beautiful references to birds, that Mishkín Qalam, who lived in close proximity to his Lord in Adrianople and served him with utter devotion and heard him day and night from his own lips verses majestic, and he basks continuously in the life-giving rays of that sun. So that could have inspired him too, because Baha'u'llah, in most of his things when he refers to himself, he says in those days, he says one of the many tablets revealed by Baha'u'llah in Adrianople was the tablet of Ahmad, in which, referring to himself, has written, Lo, the nightingale of paradise, singeth upon the twigs of the tree of eternity with holy and sweet melodies. Then again he speaks of, in the same tablet, he mentions his imprisonment, Adrianople. Thus that the nightingale utters his call unto you from this prison. Then there's another tablet of bereavement, a nightingale of bereavement. In it, Baha'u'llah reminds his loved ones that the period of union has come to an end, and that the nightingale of paradise has taken its flight from one branch and is now able to establish its nest on another. And he rebukes the people of sedition for turning to the birds of night, Mirza Yahya and his associates. It's very strange, but Baha'u'llah mentions about the birds of nights, like the bats also. Even Abdul Baha doesn't use it in a very nice context. And these same utterances which inspired Mishkín Qalam may have grieved him when he was separated from Baha'u'llah and sent with Yahya to Cyprus. And the following prayer of Baha'u'llah, revealed in Adrianople and which perhaps Mishkín Qalam chanted many times, quote, "But for him, how could the celestial dove have uttered its songs, or the heavenly nightingale, according to the decree of God, have warbled its melody?" Mishkín Qalam has, as mentioned earlier, worked into two different kinds of birds, one that looked like dove and the other like the rooster. And in many tablets and writings, Baha'u'llah makes references to himself as the nightingale of paradise, bird of utterance, dove of eternity, the mystic dove, the phoenix, and so on. Perhaps the one that inspired and interested him was Baha'u'llah's tablet to Nasr al-Din Shah of Persia, under whom Mishkín Qalam had worked as a calligrapher. This tablet was revealed in Adrianople, and Baha'u'llah addresses him in these words, "O King, wert thou to incline thine ear to the shrill of the pen of glory and the cooing of the dove of eternity, which, on the branches of the low tree beyond which there is no passing, uttereth praises to God, the maker of all names and creator of earth and heaven." It must have given Mishkín Qalam a thrill to read about the shrill of the pen, as this is the sound which is so familiar to him, and it only comes out of the pen made from reeds, which Mishkín Qalam and his writers used in those days. He also may have been inspired to do the calligraphy of the dove of eternity on the branches of the low tree, or the bird of paradise in the form of the greatest holy name sitting on the tree of Tuba, which you find in the memorials of the faithful, the cover. It was a great bounty to have visited Mr. Faizi, the hand of the cause, a few years ago in the Holy Land. He talked so lovingly about Mishkín Qalam, and he admired him so much, and he was himself a very good calligraphist. And he told me how Mishkín Qalam prayed before he did his calligraphy, how he prepared his own paper, dipping in starch solution, hanging it in the sun till the starch flowed down, creating a cloudy design known as cloudy paper. Then it was held on hard marble and the starch rubbed till it became smooth. And he then would find something inspiring to write. But he had to take accurate measurements to make sure that it fitted properly on the prepared paper. He also prepared his own ink, as he could not trust the one that he could buy in the bazaar, because it may have sand and ruin his work. And the ink was made with soot mixed with solution of oil, which made it jet black. He put a small amount of ink in an inkwell, and at the bottom of it he put a piece of silk thread that would absorb all the ink, and then he would dip his reed pen so it would not drip. He would then support the paper on the palm of his hands and his knees and start his calligraphy. At times it took him a whole day just to write 2 lines. And here, if I didn't finish this in one day, I was getting so impatient about it. And Mr. Faizi, he demonstrated to me how it was done with the reed pen. And then he said, "Did you hear the shrill of the pen?" And I did. And he gave such a beautiful laughter. He says, this was what Baha'u'llah was referring to in his writing when he wrote, "O Lord, by the shrill voice of the pen of glory." Because when they would write with the reed, it made that shrill noise. And Mr. Faizi regretted that this art today is dying and the people use pen and ink which fades after some time. And the calligrapher composed the characters and proportioned them to the point width. Sometimes just to write one letter like noon, N, it took half an hour maybe. And Mishkín Qalam taught calligraphy to Mirza Muhammad Ali, the son of Baha'u'llah, who later became a master in the art of calligraphy and invented his own script known as Khatt-e-Badi. But unfortunately, he became a covenant breaker afterwards. Mishkín Qalam also told us in the pictures that you see, the slides, he said, watch for the fingers of Mishkín Qalam. See how long his fingers were. He says, all artists should have long fingers. And he said that at times when Abdul Baha and the friends would be very cast down and sad, he said he would take it with the long fingers, he would cast a silhouette on the wall, for example, a crow fighting with a small bird. And that would make Abdul Baha laugh. Mr. Faizi ended his unforgettable interview with the story of how one day in Akka, Baha'u'llah invited Mishkín Qalam and a few companions to visit him in Baji. And when they got out of their rooms, it was a short distance to Abdul Baha's room, but they got wet because it was raining. And Mishkín Qalam, when he probably got wet with his long hair and his scraggly little beard, he must have looked quite a sight. And Baha'u'llah turned to him and asked him what had happened. And he said, Mishkín Qalam replied that either Baha'u'llah could have invited us a little later or sent a rain a little earlier. And Baha'u'llah was quite amused. He also told us that Mishkín Qalam accepted the Baha'i faith. When he accepted the Baha'i faith, he was like a darwish with long flowing hair and detached. And it says that when he was going on this journey, that he was made to share this room with this other companion. And when he entered the room, Mishkín Qalam said, "Oh God, Ya Allah." And the stranger happened to be a Baha'i and asked him whether he knew God since he mentioned his name. And Mishkín Qalam said, "Of course." The stranger said, "No, you must know the Prophet of your time to know God." And he then told him all about Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith, and it says that Mishkín Qalam accepted it, and by the next morning he was a Baha'i. And then this must be the same Sayyid Mehdi probably who I mentioned earlier. I won't go into the history of calligraphy and things, that's very easy for you to read. But in the Islamic world, calligraphy had a spiritual as well as aesthetic value. And it says that the calligrapher is an artist who copies, and the text which he has to copy is given in advance. At the point where the meaning unfolds, an image appears which enchants language. It transforms into a divine or magical formula. The tip of the pen is what marks the difference between cultures. And it says, the Arabic calligraphers considered that their art was the geometry of the soul expressed through the body. You see, in those days, during the time of Islam, they were not allowed to have any pictures or paintings into the mosque, and this is why they excelled in calligraphy. Mishkín Qalam, coming from an Islamic background, may have been influenced by its art and tradition. The one perhaps that led him to the rooster-like birds may have been derived by him being influenced by the Dekhol Ash, rooster of heaven, which is an Islamic tradition according to which when the rooster in heaven sings, that the rest of the roosters on earth sing too at dawn. He may have been influenced by that, and perhaps most influenced by the divine utterance of Baha'u'llah. O Shaykh, thou hast heard the sweet melodies of the doves of utterance, cooing upon the branches of the low tree of knowledge. Hearken now unto the notes of the birds of wisdom, upraised in the most sublime paradise. And it's most comforting when Baha'u'llah, the Supreme Pen, left us gems of wisdom to meditate and to be thankful. He says, the soul that has remained faithful to the cause of God and stood unwaveringly firm in his path shall, after his ascension, be possessed of such power that all the worlds which the Almighty has created can benefit through him. Such a soul provided at the bidding of the ideal king and divine educator, the pure leaven that leaveneth the world of being, and furnisheth the power through which the arts and the wonders of the world are made manifest. Those souls that are the symbols of detachment are the leavens of the world. One such pure detached soul was Mishkín Qalam, who left us with a new art, fused of all the beauty of the world of the past, but new. Now furnisheth the power through which the arts and wonders of the world are made manifest. Thank you.